Good morning, everyone, and thanks for hanging around. My name is Dave Warburton. I'm with F5 Networks. Now, some of you may know F5 from the application delivery and application security solutions that we have, but I'm not talking about any of that today. I recently moved over to our threat intelligence team. And so what I do now is look at global attack trends. And F5 Labs tries to produce threat intelligence information and data that can basically help anyone from customers to non-customers help focus their security architecture and buying decisions in the right place. So I wanted to talk a bit about organized cybercrime. We've had some similar and really interesting conversations this morning. Now, what I've done to compile this talk is draw from a number of different sources. I've taken information from Europol's IOCTA report, which is a really good read, and I definitely recommend you all look at that if you haven't already. I've got some information from the UK Crime Agency, our own threat intelligence, to really try and bring a very holistic picture into organized cybercrime. Now, we're probably all quite familiar with these threat actors. They're fairly familiar. We've got the very young kids, the script kiddies. We've got hacktivism, we've got the nation-state attacks, and of course, cybercrime. But drawing a line between these actors doesn't really help us, because actually what we find is that a lot of these threat actors work together or share tools. So we may find that some malware that's designed initially to steal banking credentials and commit financial fraud, that can actually be picked up by nation states and APTs and then repurposed to actually attack and steal corporate or government data as well. So these groups really do blend into almost into one threat actor in terms of the tools they use. So is there any purpose and usefulness in understanding the attacker, in having any kind of attribution? Well, I think it can be. I think it's useful to understand the tools that they use, the methods, and really what attackers are doing to help automate and scale their attacks. Because if you understand that, then hopefully you're spending the right amount of time securing the right things. Now, cybercrime is a very catch-all term that academia and media they just throw out cybercrime to mean everything. From our perspective, though, there's two different types of cybercrime. There's the kind of traditional crime, so the existing organized crime groups. They've been around for hundreds, thousands of years, committing fraud, just performing everyday financial fraud and criminal activities. And all that IT and the internet has done is help them scale their activities. In 2017, Interpol helped take down 20,000 sites that were selling counterfeit goods. And this wasn't on the dark web, this was just on a regular kind of surface web that anyone can get to. But then we have the cyber-dependent crime. So this is the newer kind of crime, which is only possible because of the internet, because of technology. Now, a big part of cyber-dependent crime relies on the anonymity that the web can provide. And a big part of anonymity comes from cryptocurrency. Because we've had malware, we've had viruses for decades, but it's only the past few years that criminals have understood how to monetize those worms, those viruses, to actually make money. And it's because of the anonymity of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies that this has become possible. And there's been a real spate of ransomware recently, particularly in the United States. Cybercriminals have worked out almost, I would say, the perfect victim for ransomware. Because ultimately, they want to try and capture very important, very personal, sensitive data with an organization that has the funds, that has the money to pay the ransom. Individuals, like if I had my laptop ransomwared, I may not have a lot of money to go and pay the ransom. But what criminals have discovered is that in the United States, at least, local government authorities have an awful lot of personal data on lots of citizens, and they have money to pay for the ransom. In many cases, the ransom is covered by cyber insurance. But in some really devastating cases, we've seen attackers go after the managed service providers. So they go after one central provider of IT services, and if they can affect that network, they can then branch out and affect dozens of other local state authorities and affect all of their systems. So what do organized crime groups look like? Well, they all vary slightly. Generally, they have a variation of roles within them. Everything starting from recon specialists, so those people that are able to go and discover everything about your company from public records. They will use social media. They will use automated tools to scan your IP space to discover what services that you have publicly available. We'll have social engineers that really, and this is playing an increasingly important part in attacks now, is that social aspect, conning or tricking users into giving away information. I think what's really interesting, though, is looking at money specialists and language specialists who aren't really anything of the sort. A lot of what we see in organized crime is this pyramid of different groups and actors. And the money specialists and language specialists are often members of the public, me, you, and we see signs on the road, work from home, 50 euros an hour, no experience needed. All you need is a computer with an internet connection. And what these members of the public don't realize is that they're working for a crime group and they might be committing financial fraud by transferring money from one account to another account without realizing. Language specialists are essentially everyday people that speak multiple languages, and they don't realize what they're doing, but what they're actually providing to the organized crime is a language translation between the ransomware attacker and the victim. The ransomware attackers may not speak English or the national language, so they'll use these in-local residents to help translate the messages between support, the criminal support team, and the actual victims as well. But ultimately, you have usually some kind of leader, someone that orchestrates the group. In this case, this is an example. This is Roman Seleznev, who is a Russian. He's the son of a prominent Russian politician who was arrested in 2017. He had 1.3 million stolen credit card numbers on his laptop, and he earned tens of millions of dollars defrauding almost 3,500 financial institutions across the world. So these organized crime groups, I think the important thing to realize is that while finance is a big aspect, and typically they go after any kind of victim they can, retail banking is interesting, but business banking is where the money is for them. They're not after making millions of euros, they want to make billions of euros. Now, the kind of makeup or the hierarchy within these groups is interesting. Clearly we have the leaders, the team leaders at the top of this team. But what's interesting from my point of view is where a lot of the raw technical skills come from. Quite often they are very young individuals, young adults or children, that get into security and research through the interest in gaming and modding the game. So you can change a computer game or a video game to maybe make it play the way you want. You can change the look of a video game. And that kind of interest in technology and hacking then leads them down, in some cases, the wrong path, and ultimately will end up working with these criminals because they will use the web forums in which these gamers go and talk to try and lure them into working for them. But the methods are changing. It used to be the case that attackers would spend a very long time creating very purposeful attack tools to target and exploit in maybe Flash or PDFs or a web browser. And these are what we call exploit kits, so we'll go and attack a number of different vulnerabilities. But what we're seeing over the past few years is a shift towards different attack tools. The big focus that we've seen over the past few years have been web injections, which I will explain a bit more in a second, and access-based attacks. So anything to do with credentials, that could be phishing or brute force attacks and so on. Because if you can steal someone's credentials, then you don't need to hack a system. You can just log straight into that platform. Now, while money isn't the driver for the youngsters getting into hacking, normally they're getting into hacking because they want the kudos, they want the respect of their peers, and they do it because it's fun. But for the leaders, it's obviously about the money, and there's multiple ways that they can get to money through traditional banking trojans that will infect your mobile phone, It could be ransomware or cryptojacking, as I mentioned, or it could be just the theft of personal data, which is then resold on dark web markets. So what we've got here, and what we're seeing more of, is this sharing of tools and services. If you look, so anyone that spent any time looking at malware and Trojans, you can look at the code and trace it back to where it came from. And quite often we see that a lot of code is shared. So 10 different ransomware infections may share the same code base. They all come from the same place. So a lot of skills are reused, and a lot of hackers, a lot of coders, developers, don't necessarily know how to market their products and get it out there. So what we've seen here, this is one example of ransomware called GanCrab. It's a very, very successful piece of ransomware that's earned billions of dollars in revenue for the attacker. And he's using the dark web to ask for help. He's saying, look, I've created this great piece of malware, but I don't know how to distribute it. So he's looking for other help, other resources, to try and get his ransomware infected on as many machines as possible. Now, I mentioned web injects as a newer form of attacking, and this is a very simple example. And the problem we've got today is that a lot of our websites, a lot of our applications, are using scripts and resources from all sorts of different places. We've got adverts coming in, we've got JavaScript utilities and live chat agents and all sorts. So our server is sending the web application to the client, but then the client goes and fetches all the components that they need. And this is a real problem for security because it means we don't have the visibility of the script that's being injected. So even though the user sees one web page, actually all of the sources are coming from different locations, and this is a real problem. In 2018, so we do a lot of research looking back at the past year's worth of breaches, and for 2018, 12% of every single data breach that we analyzed was due to some kind of web inject. And in just those web inject attacks, that resulted in 1.3 million stolen credit card details. But phishing, as I said, is a big problem as well, because if you can get access to someone's credentials, to someone's username and password, then you don't have to hack or attack anything. Banking malware, banking and financial attacks have always been a big problem. And what we're seeing is an increase now in mobile banking. As mobile banking is taking off, it's now the majority of traffic for many financial institutions. If you can create a phishing email and have a victim click on the link that then installs some Trojan, some malware, that malware will just sit quietly and wait for you to visit the right web page. As soon as you visit your bank or any one of a few websites that this malware is looking for, it will then silently inject some code which then steals passwords and credentials and so on. And phishing and malware sites are getting increasingly hard to spot, and the reason they're getting harder to spot is that they're using more and more legitimate services. In many cases, we see phishing websites hosted on official platforms like office.com. And of course, this is a big problem because it's got a valid certificate. So the user looks for the padlock in the corner, and great, we've got a padlock, so it must be secure, right? It's got a valid domain name, so if our enterprises are filtering, looking for bad websites, everybody needs to go to office.com. So looking out for these kind of malicious phishing websites is becoming increasingly difficult. Now, once the attackers have got these credentials, once they've phished a user, stolen the credentials, what are they using them for? And there's two primary use cases that we're seeing for these stolen credentials. The first is resale. So we see something called credential stuffing attacks, and this is where the attackers will get big data breaches from a Yahoo or some other massive data breach. So they've got all these valid credentials, and they try them against thousands, tens of thousands of websites to see which ones work. Once they figure out which ones work, they can go and resell them for more money on the dark web. The other kind of credential misuse we see is around new account creation attacks. So taking these valid names and addresses and passwords and creating new fraudulent accounts. Now, from a finance point of view, this is primarily for financial fraud. And what's interesting, I think, is if you look at the amount of transactions for new accounts, the little purple sliver in the pie chart, it's a very, very small percent of all traffic hitting financial sites is to create a new account. But the amount of malicious transactions to do with new accounts is significantly higher than normal logins. Now, to scale these attacks, criminals are not sitting down manually typing in attacks every time they want to do it. They're automating it. They're using massive botnets comprised of tens or hundreds of thousands of devices. In many cases, these are weak IoT devices, so smart fridge, smart TVs, home routers, and printers, and so on. These are often vulnerable, they have default credentials, and they're very, very easy to take over. So these huge botnets are creating huge attacks, and they're not only creating large volumetric attacks, volumetric DDoS attacks, as we just heard, but they're actually launching these credential-based attacks, either credential stuffing, brute force, or new account creation attacks. And the way that we've dealt with these kind of bots, these automated attacks before, has been to throw a captcha. So if you've seen this this annoying kind of image and you have to guess or you have to try and understand what the words are and you type in the words, well, that used to be a good way of stopping bots because a script, a bot, couldn't understand the words in the image. But attackers have figured out a way around that, and what they do now is they have a farm of people, so not servers, they have a team of thousands of people around the world that work for very little money. When the bot gets a captcha, they send the captcha as an image to this farm of people. So I could log in to this farm, I could log in for this attacking captcha solving service. I will see the image, I will give the answer, so I'll type in the answer, that will get sent back to the bot, and the bot can then use that answer to carry on the attack on the website. So as attackers are always changing and coming up with quite innovative ways of dealing with these security solutions. Now, I've mentioned cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is interesting. Bitcoin, there are many, many new cryptocurrencies, but Bitcoin is still the most popular from a fraud, a ransomware, and a financial crimes point of view. And early in the decade, we saw a huge percentage of Bitcoin transactions going to dark web markets that were selling illegal firearms or drugs, for example. And it looks like the amount of money, the percentage, drops off significantly. But sadly, that wasn't due to a fall in organized crime. That was actually just because more people used Bitcoin for legitimate reasons. Actually, what we see is if we look at the value, the amount of money going to darknet sites, that continued to rise until 2017. And it was at this point, actually, that some of the largest darknet markets were taken down by law enforcement, such as Europol. The problem is that whilst this led to an initial decline in the use of Bitcoin for cybercrime, what actually happened is that new darknet markets were popping up to replace the ones that were taken down. And actually, cybercriminals were then using their traditional communication means to transfer money. They weren't using darknet markets, so they would be using peer-to-peer applications or just meeting face-to-face. But for those sites and services on darknet, they're becoming more automated. The attackers, the criminals, are trying to help the consumers of their stolen goods buy their services and products that much easier. So when it comes to stolen credentials and usernames, for example, it used to be the case that it was a bit like eBay. You would go onto a darknet market and say, I'd like 1 million credentials, please, and you'd have to bid for or pay what you wanted. Now it's completely automated. You can go into darknet markets, you can ask for credentials or credit cards that come from a certain country. You can ask for ones that have been validated. The validated ones with credential stuffing are worth more money. And everything's just completely automated, so you just pay for what you use. And there's clearly many, many other services on darknet markets, including just offering their services for hire. So I could be a ransomware author, and I could put my skills out there to let other people hire me to create some new ransomware. So looking from a local perspective, that we haven't seen a huge amount of cybercrime originating from Hungary, but there has been a huge amount of focus of attacks coming into Hungary. A few years ago, there was quite a big phishing campaign that hit 3 of the biggest financial institutions. And Europol are reporting that Hungary is amongst the top 7 countries in the world for receiving malicious emails with infected attachments. Looking to the future, though, there's a significant proportion of attacks coming from IoT, as I mentioned, but perhaps the biggest risk at the moment is the increased use of mobile and the increasing adoption of open banking and PSD2. So for those in the finance space, opening up your information through APIs are going to be the next big attack vector. Because what we've seen is that people generally have good security in front of their web application, but their API, which points to the same data, doesn't have the same kind of security and visibility. In terms of solving this problem, it's not easy. I don't know if anyone can guess. The numbers on the graph there are the average age for a convicted criminal in the UK. So fraud and drugs, you're looking at almost 35 to 40 years old. But the average age of the convicted criminal for cybercrime is just 17. So clearly there's a massive change, massive difference in the kinds of people that are conducting these crimes. And this is why I think it's really important to get really good education in from the schools very early to help our kids that are into hacking and IT and encourage them to use their skills for good. So I'm almost done. If anyone wants to know anything about the solutions that we do have or anything more about the research that we've got, please feel free to come and see us on the booth later on today. Thank you very much.